On November 18th, 1978, the world was shocked by the aftermath of what a single person's influence could have over many when used for evil. With the use of manipulation, paranoia, fear, mental and physical abuse, one man was able to cause the death of almost 1,000 people. But why? Are we as a species so determined to belong that we're willing to die for it? Some were. Others discovered too late that they couldn't turn back, and a select few survived the nightmare. This video involves sensitive subjects and disturbing historic audio from the last night of the events. Viewer discretion is advised. So, if you're ready, let's take a trip into Jonestown. To understand what happened at Jonestown, we first have to go back to the beginning and understand who Jim Jones was. Born May 13, 1931 in Crete, Indiana, Jones experienced the effects of the Depression, having to live in a shack with no plumbing. At a young age, Jones took up an interest in religion and dictators, studying the lives and works of Marx, Stalin, and Hitler. Perhaps this was red flag number 1. Other kids his age called Jones really weird, saying he was obsessed with religion and death, and as a result, he didn't have very many friends. Jones would often hold funerals for small animals on his parents' property, and once stabbed a cat to death, behavior often seen in serial killers. I would call this red flag number 2. Jones graduated from Richmond High School early. He was a very intelligent student, which is also a common trait in those who end up controlling others. Jones married at age 18 to Marceline Baldwin, who moved with him to Indianapolis, where he attended university in 1951 and graduated with a secondary degree in education by 1961. While his education was going on, Jones was also busy getting involved with the church. In 1952, he became a junior pastor at the Somerset Southside Methodist Church, but he quickly left after the leadership wouldn't let him integrate African Americans into his congregation. He had a plan, however. After witnessing a faith healing service at the Seventh-day Baptist Church, he noticed that it really attracted a lot of people and their money. Wanting his own church to do what he wanted with, Jones held a massive religious convention where healing evangelist and famous author Reverend William M. Branham came and drew a crowd so that he could get the funding he needed. After the convention, Jones was able to open his own church and titled it the People's Temple, at that time affiliated with the Disciples of Christ. He had no theological training, and the church really had no denomination, but that really wasn't what he was trying to do. He'd been studying monsters like Hitler his whole life, and even got advice from Father Divine telling him, find an enemy, a common enemy. It will unify them and make them subservient to you. He'd been training his entire life to become a cult leader. In the mid-1960s, Jones and his wife had gained around 100 followers and settled just outside the city of Ukiah, thinking that it would protect them from nuclear holocaust. By 1972, he'd opened up another 2 churches in San Francisco and Los Angeles. By now, he'd become quite the respected churchman, making friends with local African-American communities, local politicians, and California press.
Sister Ingram, you're concerned about the losing of your sight. You're not able to see me clearly. Things just blur to you. You have to stumble around lately through crowds and are not able to see even people's faces close up to you clearly.
That's true.
You've told me nothing about your condition. Is that
No,
correct?
I haven't.
By now, his followers were in the thousands, and they came around to watch his faith healings and mind readings. He looked like a saint to the public, but there were cracks in the surface of his disguise that showed a demon beneath. The treatment of his followers were less than humane. Members would often be humiliated, blackmailed, and beaten. Some were brainwashed into signing over their possessions and the deeds to their homes. Jones was creating a dependence on the church and making escape difficult and impossible. After taking their possessions, Jones often used paranoia and fear to create a need to stay, telling minorities of the church that if they were to leave, the government would round them up and put them into camps. Family members were often kept apart and told to report on each other to sniff out anybody who was betraying the church. Now, we're starting to look a little culty. Now, by 1977, the California media was starting to get a little suspicious. Rumors of the People's Temple abusing their members, mistreating children, and even financial fraud created some questions that Jones didn't like. But he was a crazy kind of paranoid, the dangerous kind, and he had been planning for this for years. 3 years prior, a group of Jones' followers had moved to Guyana to create a compound where they could eventually relocate. Due to the fact that the encampment was in a remote location of a very primitive and overstrained government, they had little control over what Jones and his followers did there, which was just what he was looking for. It was allowed to exist as a self-sustaining, self-governing settlement run by Americans on their foreign land. So, when questions started to get a little too dicey for Jones, he invited his congregation to move with him to the newly built Jonestown. The camp was promised to be a socialist utopia, but upon entering, it proved to be anything but paradise. Members were separated from their family and removed of possessions like their passports in order to keep them trapped there. Letters home were heavily censored or sometimes never even sent, and members were told to continue to tell on each other and attend late-night meetings run by Jones. By now, the tyrannical leader was experiencing some declining health, but when told that it was just a lung infection, he lied to his followers, telling them it was lung cancer in order to gain more sympathy and loyalty from them. The infection did create an addiction to painkillers, however, which helped to fuel Jones' paranoia, and he would spread that to his followers. He would even run suicide drills in the middle of the night, known as White Night rehearsals. He knew very well that this wasn't going to be okay. The drills were a screwed-up form of mental abuse. Members would be pulled out of their beds in the middle of the night and brought to the pavilion, where they would line up and have to drink a mysterious red liquid. Jones then told them that it was poison and they would be dead in 45 minutes. After nothing happened, he told them that it was just a test run to see how loyal they were, but that the real trial was coming soon. Despite all this, Jones still had a solid amount of brainwashed followers and believers willing to die when he said die. Jones's plan wasn't airtight, however, for former People's Temple members and relatives were starting to get worried and wanted answers. They convinced Congressman Leo Ryan, a Democrat from California, to fly into Jonestown to see what was going on. Ryan arrived in Jonestown November 17, 1978, and at first, everything on the outside looked all right, because Jones was telling his people to answer that they loved this place, even if they didn't. They'd have to run rehearsals with him and answer questions he thought Ryan would ask them the way he wanted them to, but not everybody would comply. On the second day of his visit, right before he was about to leave, several members of the People's Temple came forward and asked the congressman to help them get passage out of Guyana. This defection upset Jones, and one of his lieutenants attacked the congressman with a knife, but he escaped unharmed. However, Jones wasn't done with them yet. He ordered that nobody leave Guyana alive, and as they boarded the airplane to head home, they were attacked by armed guards. 5 were killed, including Congressman Ryan. Jones knew that he wasn't going to get away with his vile actions, so it was time for him to activate his kill switch plan. A select few members of the Jones cult were living off base in Georgetown, including his son Stephen. The night of the 18th, Jones radioed trusted Temple member Sharon Amos and told her, "You're going to meet Mr. Fraser," his code for death. Amos, along with 22-year-old Leanne, took 2 children into the back room and ended their lives with a butcher knife before ending each other's. The only good that came of these radio transmissions was that they were intercepted by a U.S. representative who was listening in to monitor the congressman's visit. But the nightmare was just beginning. Back at Jonestown, Jim was making a white knight call, gathering everybody in the main pavilion to commit what they called a revolutionary act.
How very much I've loved you. How very much I've tried my best to give you the good life. But in spite of all of that I've tried, a handful of our people, with their lies, have made our life impossible. There's no way to detach ourselves from what's happened today. Not only we're in a compound situation, not only are there those who have left and committed the betrayal of the century. Some have stolen children from others, and they're in pursuit right now to kill them because they stole their children. And we are sitting here waiting on a powder keg. I don't think this is what we want to do with our babies. I don't think that's what we had in mind to do with our babies. It was said by the greatest of prophets from time immemorial, no man takes my life from me, I lay my life down.
Children were the first to go. Those who had no choice and didn't understand what they were dying for were force-fed syringes filled with a mixture of cyanide sedatives and a powdered fruit drink by nurses and their own parents. Adults then lined up to take what Jones called their potion, while armed guards lined the walls. They too would be administered the poison after everybody else was gone. The poison took 5 minutes for children to submit to it, and an agonizing 20 to 30 minutes for adults. It's not known whether anybody knew it was a real drill or not. The screams and crying on the recording tapes that night are agonizing. After tracking the radio transmission and running it by the FBI, Guyana officials arrived at the camp the morning of the 19th to a horrific discovery. 909 bodies blanketed the ground, a third of which were children. There were a select few who escaped into the woods around the compound, and those who refused to end their lives in Georgetown, including Jones' son Stephen. Jim Jones was found in the main pavilion, having taken his own life from a gunshot wound to the head. He never had to pay for his crimes, and he didn't even go out the way he made 900 other people go. He was a monster and a coward. In the end, only one member of the People's Temple was tried for the crimes of November 18th, Larry Layton, who was tried in the U.S. for conspiracy and aiding in the death of Leo Ryan. He was sentenced life in prison, but unfortunately, he was released in 2002. I think the story of Jonestown is scary to me because it shows that it can be accomplished by one man who has an understanding of the human mind, and that with the right amount of manipulation, it can certainly happen again. We're a social species who want to belong and believe in something, and that's not always a bad thing, but when it's turned against us, we can be lied to, manipulated, and brainwashed into doing a number of horrific actions just because our betters told us to. I like to think that we can take a story like this and apply it in our own lives to see if we're being manipulated and perhaps prevent those effects. I'd like to thank my friend Horror Stories for suggesting this story to me. It's something I wanted to cover for a long time. I just wanted to give it the length and research that it deserved. There's a huge chance that it's not going to be monetized or enjoyed by YouTube, but I wasn't going to censor it because it's a very important story. All I ask is that you leave the video a like and subscribe for more true crime and bad horror movie reviews. Game with me on Twitch, follow me on Twitter, and as always, be well.